main man. Appreciate him joining us. Howard Balzer joins the show.
Yeah.
Howard, how you doing, brother?
How you doing, Howard?
Doing great. Draft day. Is there any better day than it? I mean, there's a lot of great days in the year for all the sports, but I don't know if there's anything that approaches draft day. And especially when I think back to 45 years ago, when I was on the first draft for ESPN, and no one knew what to expect. It was total, I don't even like being lost in trees and the forest and all those things. And I always remember back to what Pete Rozelle, the commissioner, then said when the new president of ESPN, Chet Simmons, who had left NBC for ESPN, when they approached and mentioned to Pete Rozelle that they were interested, this is only 2 months before the draft in like February, they're interested in televising it. And Rozelle said, why would you want to do that? Who would want to watch this?
I remember that.
Here we are 45 years later. So
hey, funny story.
Never gets old. Never gets old.
That's amazing.
Pete and my father grew up together, went to Compton High School together, Compton College together. I got pictures of them in the breakfast nook there. Unbelievable pictures I have. They all grew up on the same block in Compton. Pete Rozelle, my father, Duke Snyder, the great legendary Dodger, and a great Western actor, James Colburn. They all grew up next to each other in Compton and in the 50s, obviously going to high school and college. So yeah, Pete was he did say that. I remember. I was like, oh shit, he wasn't ahead of the time on that shot. But hey, let me ask you something, Howard. You've been covering this for 45 years, and you're on that first draft, and then Mel Kipers and all the people have come along. Let me ask you something. Smitty and I have a debate going. Do you see the same hunger now that college has done what it's done with the NIL and the transfer portal when it comes to having their names called? Over the last 3 or 4 years, I've been saying, I don't think they give a shit anymore. I don't think they care like they once did. They already got paid. I don't know if the love is there. And obviously it's just human nature. I don't know. I'm not blaming the kid totally, but I just don't know if that hunger is there. Are you seeing anything change over the last few years?
I think it's something that's evolving. It's a great question. I have heard from different NFL people that with all the things that the scouts and the personnel people have to analyze going into the draft, when you look at obviously ability, that's number one on the list, but you also then look at character and the passion for the game that players have, and how much do they really love football. And so now that you've injected the money into it from the college level, you do wonder, and that's something that teams are considering. But they've always considered that to a degree. How much do they really love football? And that's sometimes the hardest thing to figure out, because players can fool teams, right? But that passion for the game, the love for the game, that's what teams are really looking for with the players they draft. And that's the guys they want on their team, guys who are team first. That, yeah, obviously they're doing it to make money and all that, but you still want those guys that are team first. So teams have always analyzed that, but it's probably even a little more now because of the background that the players bring to the pro game. And so, and the other thing is, how many of them really make a lot of money in college? Yeah, there's a certain amount of them.
Right.
But
90%, yeah. Don't.
Every guy coming into the NFL, even if you come in as a third or fourth round draft pick, your contract, it still can be life-changing money, but it's certainly not what a first-round pick gets. But you're also pointing to that second contract where you can hit it big, as we've seen some of these deals that, contract extensions that players have gotten in the last few weeks, not to mention the free agent deals. So that's certainly what a lot of guys are shooting for. But you're not going to make that money unless you really have that pure love for the game and be able to transfer your skills and play at an NFL level, which is a huge, huge jump in every aspect, whether it's physical or whether it's mental.
Howard, you've been doing it so long. How do you vet that? How do I sit there and say, oh, fuck, how do I know the love of your game, son? Like, that's why I missed the Gruden stuff when they had all the quarterbacks in there grilling them, especially that position. But, like, are we getting to a point where everything's on social media now anyway? We may be doing video. We may have Netflix doing a new series on bringing in all these players, especially the 16. I believe there's 16 that get invited to New York or whatever, or wherever it's at, Green Bay. those 16 may have specific interviews to vet this, like, because you can't screen for that, right?
Well, you try, and that's where the good talent evaluators come in. And maybe I shouldn't just say talent evaluators, people evaluators. I mean, how different is it than any job interview where someone's who has the here? I remember Bruce Arians when he was 1 year at the combine. Someone said, "What do you really gain from the combine?" And he said, "Well, we try to find out what's up here and what's in here." And that's so important, but you can be fooled, sometimes. But it's a gut instinct that you have for people, and just having that feel, hey, this is a guy who really wants it. Not only who wants an NFL career, but also understands how you have to work every day once you get there to get better. The goal is, hey, get better today than you were yesterday, and continue that through your career. And you can try to find it out, but you can't do it in a 15-minute interview at the combine. You can get a little more if you bring somebody in for a 30 visit to the team and you're around them for a little bit. But you still have to be able, you hope, to be able to figure out what all these guys are made of. And so I think those that have it, you can readily see.
Right.
But then there's a whole bunch of others that you're kind of just playing a little bit of a guessing game.
Nah, for sure, man, for sure. I want to talk about, the draft, currently drafts today. JB and I have been kind of talking about this for the last few days about, what do we think is going to happen with the first round, specifically the first 10 picks. JB, he's a believer that he thinks something like crazy is going to probably happen with pick 2 and 3, the Browns and Giants. He believes that those are going to be like the kind of the picks of the night, and kind of decide like, hey, will they trade those picks back and try to do something there? I guess. What are some of your just thoughts on the draft today? And do you see anything happening with the first 10 picks?
Go to Vegas and play some craps, right?
Right.
Roll the dice.
Yeah.
I mean, I always kind of chuckle when, there's so much discussion about all this. Heck, I remember way back in the day, when those of us who did mock drafts, we did one. We did one each year. Now you've got thousands of them out there. In fact, we'll have a mock draft after the draft for next year, even though no one even knows what the order of selection is.
Right.
But there is so much chatter about it that you can get lost in all that information and noise sometimes, and think that what's going to happen. Well, no one really knows. And I'll tell you this. Here's a little that everyone should realize. Even the teams don't know what's going to happen in terms of how it'll play out. And I always laugh at the word surprise. Oh, I'm so surprised that happened. Well, why should you be surprised? Haven't you watched the draft before? Sometimes I think that there are people who drop down from another planet, have never seen a draft before, and think they know it. But there's always surprises. But you're right. Those the second and third pick, I think we know who those guys are going to be. It's going to be Abdul Carter and Travis Hunter. Will the Browns and the Giants stay where they are? Could there be a trade? I don't think that this draft, guys, there's a lot of good football players in this draft. There's not a lot of team changers, if you will, at least that you can really predict. And so when you have a guy like Carter, when you have a guy like Hunter, it's going to take an awful lot to be convinced to trade down and settle for somebody else. So I would expect them to go chalk for those 2 and 3 picks. And then I think the other picks that are really, be changers is maybe Jacksonville at 5.
Yeah.
A lot of people have said that the Genty from Boise State, the running back, he's going to the Raiders. Well, don't be surprised if the Jaguars take him. Don't be surprised by anything. And so I think there's some inflection points in this draft where you just don't know what's going to happen. And then the thing is this. Gil Brandt told me this once, the late, great Hall of Famer Gil Brandt. There's not 32 players with first-round grades. There never is.
Nope.
But there have to be 32 guys taken in the first round. And he once told me, once you get to the middle of the first round, there's not that much difference between those guys and then guys who are taken in the middle of the second round. And that's where, a lot of wild things that can happen. And I think we'll see, quite a bit of that when it kicks off this evening.
Let me ask you this. That's a great breakdown there. One name that keeps getting brought up, and this probably is going to be the news of the night, is Shedeur Sanders. It sounds like, man, a lot of people are saying that Shedeur will not be a top 10 pick based upon needs of the teams and just kind of the different mock drafts there. Do you agree? Where do you see Shedeur Sanders falling, I guess, tonight? Is it possible that he falls out of the first round?
It's possible. I don't think that'll happen because I think if he starts, quote, sliding, and I think a big thing is sometimes it's not about the player. It's about what teams are looking for. Now, that doesn't mean that some teams aren't looking for a quarterback. But I also think that there's a pretty good second tier of quarterbacks that teams believe that they could possibly get in the second round. Now, having said that, you could see some trades back into the late first round by some of those teams to get a quarterback like Sanders, or maybe even one of the other ones that are available. So he will be, I think, one of the huge stories of the draft, and where he goes. Some of the things that have been said about him, I think, are unfortunate because there's always this stuff that's thrown out there. You don't know what the agenda is or where it's coming from. And so, but you can make a case for the Saints. I don't know that they'll do that. You can make it, a lot of people think the Steelers might jump on him at 21, which is certainly a possibility, but that would surprise me if he gets out of the first round. But I'll say this. I know ESPN did, or maybe it was NFL Network, whoever it was, did something in the last week or two on the 1984 draft when everyone thought Boomer Esiason was the top pick in the draft, top quarterback in the draft, and all of a sudden he slid totally out of the first round, and the Bengals ended up with him, and he had a very an excellent NFL career. So those things happen. It's just the reality of it. And the interesting thing with this draft is where last year you had 6 quarterbacks taken in the first 12, which all the other teams that weren't looking for a quarterback loved because it pushed players at other positions to them. Right now, if Cam Ward goes and then Shedeur Sanders isn't taken, well, all of a sudden the team's sitting in the middle of the first round or at 10 or something like that. They could theoretically get a lesser player than they would have gotten if there were a lot of quarterbacks available.
Good point.
Or there are a lot of quarterbacks available, but not to the level of last year. So all those things I think are going to be very intriguing at what we watch and see this evening.
Let me ask you this. The running back class is heavy, maybe the deepest in the draft, maybe the deepest in a while. Genty, in my opinion, you have to absolutely love him to make a swap from 6 to 5 if you're Pete Carroll and the Raiders to take that Jacksonville pick if you really think Jacksonville might snatch him up, right? Because there's other backs available for Pete Carroll to say, all right, I'm not gonna make a dramatic deal here in a trade to move up one spot to lock up Genty, because I think that's the earliest he goes, unless the Giants have some sort of reckoning for losing Saquon and have to appease the fan base and say, we're taking Ashton Genty, which I predicted a couple weeks ago that could happen. I don't see it anymore, but you got to be in love with Genty as good as these other backs are, right?
No doubt about it. And the thing that's interesting is that the first thing I think when you mention the Giants is when a new running back comes in, they're probably going to be pretty good right to start. But will the Giants want to reach another situation potentially to have with him 3 or 4 years down the road?
Exactly.
Like they had with Saquon Barkley, because that's where the issues begin. When that running back comes close to that next contract. We saw the Rams invest heavily many years ago in Todd Gurley. That didn't work out for them in that second contract. Even the Cowboys, even though Ezekiel Elliott had some good years after that first contract, he wasn't the same guy. And that usually happens with running backs. We're seeing it now with James Cook, the Bills. I mean, he's a guy who wants a new deal, and the Bills are saying, whoa, let's it's not that they're saying they don't want to give him one, but they don't want the money that the guy is looking for. So teams do look down the road in the draft. But I don't think the Seahawks would trade up because, like you said, there's a whole bunch of other guys, and they probably feel that they can wait until
the Raiders now. Sorry, the Raiders with Pete Carroll. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's true. Yeah, good point.
Yeah.
They can figure they can get a running back later. I mean, we see all through the draft, running backs that came in a later round that ended up being players for a long time for teams. I mean, heck, Alvin Kamara is still playing for the Saints, and he was a 3rd-round pick. So you can get good value, and there are a bunch of good running backs, like you said, in this draft. So I don't see the Raiders, doing something like that. Now, maybe if the Jaguars didn't want that much for that pick, But anytime you give up something to move up, then you're losing an opportunity to add another player to a team. And if you're the Raiders, you need players, and you don't want to give up that draft capital unless it's really something great and you don't have to give up too much.
Hey, Howard, Smitty and I did a mock draft. We're going to show you to try to get your take on it. But before that, though, I want to ask you, not a mock draft, but a top 10. I want to ask you, the fact that the wideout crew this year is not as good or deep as we've seen, probably not as even thought about as well as we have. O-line as well. I don't think there's a big-time game-changing tackle in this draft. I just don't. I haven't watched especially the top-tier guys. How much does that affect these other teams' decisions? Because offensive line is always premium, especially when you have a young QB like New England or one of these teams that you got to protect his blind side. If there's not that, though, are you taking does it go straight to best player available over the last 45 years that you've witnessed when there is down positions in the draft? Because there's a lot, in my opinion. Running backs are heavy. DBs aren't as good as normal. Wideouts aren't as good as normal. And O-line. That leaves me with a heavy pass rushing draft, which we do have. And are we going to see what we saw last year in quarterbacks this year with pass rushers?
Very well could be. Sometimes those guys are a little hard to evaluate. I mean, they're not hard to evaluate, but they're hard to project sometimes because there's so much expectation that if you pick that edge rusher, he's going to walk on the field and get 12 sacks. And it's a lot, it's a lot harder than that. But there will be a good run on edge rushers, especially depending after Abdul Carter, who's the next one that goes, because we see those runs in the draft every year. Even, we saw it with tackles last year. There were 4 tackles taken in the top 10 players. But you can only pick from what's available. And when there's so much bunching up at a lot of positions, well, you just got to go with your gut and say, okay, this tackle might not be, off from last year, but he's the best available. So we've got to take him. Some of those edge rushers have some injury questions about them, but it really makes this draft because of, like I said, there's so many guys at different positions that are close. I mean, even the wide receivers, you mentioned last year, there were 3 taken in the first 9. And then there wasn't another one taken until Brian Thomas Jr. at 23. But guess what? From 23 to 37, there were 7 receivers taken, including Thomas. So there was that secondary run on that position. And so we will see that at different positions. The edge rusher might be a little bit, ahead of those other ones. But we also see, as I see your top 10, we also see a guy like Armand Membu, who you have at 6. There's a guy in another year, he might not be a top 10 guy, but he's one of the best tackles available. So he probably will be. A lot of mocks have him going to the Jets, but who knows about that? But that's a pretty good list there. I don't know if Tyler Warren will go that early.
And I was going to ask you that right now. That's my shot in the dark. I could see the Patriots taking a tackle here. If I had to bet on it, I would say they took a tackle. But at the same time, I know they've been trying to replace Gronk for some time. Not saying that Warren is, but a safety blanket near the line of scrimmage for a young quarterback is a big, big piece, integral piece to a QB's development as we get older here. And they don't have any wideouts in this draft because we know the New England needs some edge. They need some outside help. But at the same time, Warren can change the game, and that's a shot in the dark here. But I was going to say, due to the lack of wideouts, though, does Tyler Warren get overdrafted because everybody wants a Brock Bowers? I just can see him moving up for that reason. That's all I had him on there for.
He might be. I mean, and that's the thing about it. You can make a case for just about anything. Yeah. And so, I mean, he's going to be a first-round pick. Obviously, where it is, we'll see. I see Jackson Dart at 9. That's a little bit of a shot in the dark, but I think he's in that next tier of quarterbacks. I'll say this, in 4 years from now, one of these guys from that next tier, whether it's Milroe from Alabama, whether it's Dart, whether it's Shuck from Louisville, Will Howard from Ohio State, one or like multiple of those guys are. I'm sorry.
No, Shuck, I like him a lot.
Yeah, probably there's just as good a chance of one of those guys, depending on where they go and the fit and the players around them, that could end up being more productive than Cam Ward or Shedeur Sanders. That's the beauty, of this all, that no one can predict the future. and no one can predict the stability that some of these teams will have with coaching, with offensive coordinators. I looked at this the other day, and we talk every year about how many new head coaches there are in the NFL every season. Well, what that also produces and creates is a lot of change in offensive coordinators. Right now, half the league, 16 teams will begin the season and begin off-season workouts with a different offensive coordinator than they had last season.
Wow.
And so that's a lot. And it's pretty close to that every year. And so when we have an off seasons and training camps that don't have there's not a lot of time, there's not a lot of contact or any of those things. And yet when the season starts, everybody expects these teams and players to be ready to go and be going at all cylinders, which just isn't realistic, especially for those teams that have made significant changes in their coaching staff.
That's a great point, Howard. Something you mentioned earlier was that at this point in time, nobody really knows where any of these players are going. Not even the teams know. So when we hear all this pre-draft news come out, these storylines of the Raiders really like Ashton Genty or this team likes this guy, is all that just hearsay? Is that just news getting put out because teams want to like confuse other teams, and it's it's all a play to try to confuse people?
Some of it is that.
Okay.
I don't think there's that much talking that really goes on with teams, but there could be, a little bit of it. But most of it is just the chatter that there is and how pervasive it is. And then you throw in, to me, one of the biggest, most laughable are the betting odds. Is that all these people talk about the betting odds and write stories about it? Well, this guy's now, he's the best, shot to go to the Patriots. Well, all the betting odds it's based on what people are wagering already. And so, a lot of people look at it and they say, well, I'm going to bet on this guy to go to this team because there's good odds and I'll make a little money if I happen to be right. And I hope they're not betting a lot of money on this stuff because you're going to lose it most of the time. So those are the things that drive the conversation, that drive the chatter. But for people to think that any of these, and don't get me wrong, I think that Mel Kiper and Daniel Jeremiah and all these people that study the draft really hard, they do an excellent job of evaluating players, but they can't evaluate each one for how they'll fit with each team. That's the most important thing. And every team's board looks totally different than the other. And I've often said this: if you took the top 5 after Abdul Carter, if you took the top 5 edge rushers after all that, after him, and then took a look at every team's board, you'd have so many different orders that would make your head dizzy. And so I don't think there's any insight. There's no inside information on what a team is truly going to do. And all we have to do is watch the draft and see that every year. You can see that. And so, but it's fun to talk about all the mock drafts. I mean, I love when people do, here's my 7-round mock draft. Yeah. I would love sometime to take the time, which wouldn't be worth my time, to go through someone's 7-round mock draft and see how many guys they really got right. It wouldn't be very money.
Yeah, it's great odds to win the lotto. Yeah, it's like the lotto. Yeah. Let me ask something, Howard, real quick. Speaking of where you are, you cover the Cardinals more in depth. You're there, Arizona. Let me ask you I believe at 16. Show the order, Bailey. I believe at 16, getting Kyler Murray extended and all these other things. A lot of holes there in Arizona in the NFC West that's getting better and better on each team. See what happens in Seattle, but Frisco we assume will be back. LA, the Rams could be one of the top 4 or 5 Super Bowl favorites. Where are you at 16 with Arizona? Can you see them moving up and trying to get into the top 10 area?
I don't think they'll move up. Now, a lot of times what drives that is if all of a sudden a player is sitting there at 10 or 11 or whatever it might be, and they thought that they would go in the top 5, that maybe there'd be a move. But I think Monty Ossenfort, the general manager, is a pretty patient guy. And I think they've put their board together. And I think the heavy emphasis is on in the trenches, offensive or defensive line. Doesn't mean they won't go somewhere else. But he's a guy, I think, that he has a pretty good feel for his board and knows that there's going to be a really good player for them at 16 and that he'll let the board come to them. And I think we'll see a good amount of that. Everyone talks about, well, trade down. Well, you have to have someone who's willing to trade up. And what you have to have there is a player and I saw you guys had on Mike March recently. I remember when I was in St. Louis, and he said the biggest thing I've learned as a head coach from my personnel people is there's very few, if not any, gotta haves. Oh, we gotta have this guy. We gotta have this guy. And that's where you can go wrong sometimes. So I believe they'll stay where they are. I think it's going to be an offensive lineman. In fact, I wrote a story on the Cards Wire that I do some work for that just posted this morning that I think they should pick Tyler Booker, the Alabama guard. You know, it's really, you mentioned the Cardinals having a lot of holes. They do have needs, no question. Every team does, but they've done a good job building this roster over the last 2 years. They've done a good job in free agency, filling in some of those holes. One of the big questions they have is who's going to be the right guard when the season begins. Right. And Tyler Booker is a guy who checks every box except for maybe a little bit on athleticism, but he ran a slow 40. Boy, when was the last time you saw an offensive lineman run 40 yards in a straight line? But every other box he checks in terms of passion, the guys the Cardinals like to look at, quote, a plug-and-play guy, a leader in college, and a guy who just absolutely loves the game. I think he should be their pick. I don't know if he will be. I don't know if he'll still be there. I think there's a good chance he will. But to me, that should be the guy that they take at number 16 overall. And the interesting thing, there's a guy named, a lot of people haven't heard of, Duke Manyweather. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name correctly.
Eddie Manyweather, brother. Okay.
And he works with offensive linemen in the pre-draft run-up. And Booker worked with him mostly because he played left guard at Alabama, and he knows that some teams might want him to play right guard, and which the Cardinals would, and that's what he's worked on throughout the offseason. And here's the little historical note. Zach Martin, the Dallas Cowboys, perennial all-pro guard who retired this offseason and is probably heading for Hall of Fame discussions starting in 2030. When he came out of school from Notre Dame, he was a tackle in college. Yep. But everybody targeted him for right guard. And guess who he worked out with before the draft, learning a little bit the nuances of that position? Duke Manyweather. Ooh. And 16th pick, which is what the Cardinals have. So it'd be very interesting if history repeats itself a little bit here.
That's a great nugget. Go ahead, JB.
Yeah. Nah, before we get him out of here, Smitty, you got a question? I wanted to ask him one thing because we'd be remiss if we didn't ask him. We got to ask you about America's team, right? The Cowboys, do you see them making a splash since they've been really quiet last few years? They haven't even made the play. Like Jerry Jones got to get out the pot, right? Like this is a move where he can make a splash. He's already alluded to it maybe. I know they need a back. They need another receiver. They lost their center, offensive line-wise. Where are we at with the Cowboys? What do you not predict, but what do you see them doing? You see them moving up or even gathering more picks?
It could go either way. And, Jerry, the one thing we do know, and you don't have to predict, is that Jerry Jones will always be, in his lifetime, the face of that franchise and is always talking. And I know in the last couple of days he came out and said, I'm working on 2 big trades here.
Yeah, he did.
Yeah. How about getting Micah Parsons' contract done?
Right.
Last year they stayed on the pot until almost the season started to get the deals done for Dak Prescott and CD Lamb, and it prevented them from doing some things in the offseason, which they haven't done a whole lot of, this year. So they have a lot of work to be done, and they remain, quote, America's team. But boy, there hasn't been a whole lot of true success over, after that run of Super Bowls, and he realizes it. He obviously, I think he wants to win. I'm not sure if he really knows how to win. And so, but that makes anything they do, open to guessing. It is a big guessing game, this whole certain amount, this whole player evaluation process, but especially the draft. And so they have needs, like you said. They'll do their best to fill them. They have, brought a lot of quality players to that team. But I will say this, when they were really good and winning 11, 12 games for a stretch of time here in the last decade, most of the time was because they had a great offensive line. And that hasn't been as great recently. And look around the league. I have a thing, guys, called collective amnesia. And that is that everyone talks about something and then later they forget what they said. Yeah. And now the big conversation is offensive line, defensive line, win in the trenches. You got to be able to do that. That's always been the case in football. And then what happens is the season starts and the offense doesn't play well. And all of a sudden, does anybody blame the offensive line on the outside? No. They're saying, oh, the offensive play caller, it's his problem. It's the quarterback's problem. Well, as Andy Reid said during Super Bowl week, one of the great quotes, someone asked him about Howie Roseman, the Eagles general manager, who, of course, he worked for when he was with Philadelphia. He said the thing that was great about Howie is he knows the importance of the trenches and then does something about it and works to improve both the offensive and defensive line. And boy, did we see that in the Super Bowl, how important it was to dismantling the Chiefs. And as Reid pointed out, no matter who you have on offense, quarterback, receivers, running back, if you don't have that offensive line, you can't be consistently productive. And so that's always the key. It will be in this draft to a degree. And so, but that's what makes it always so fun to watch. And as getting back to what I was talking about with the Cowboys, they've lost a bunch of really good players on that line over recent years. And, there's a question of whether they've really replaced them with high quality players, and keeping that line together is really hard, especially in this age of free agency and injuries hit. Man, it's really difficult. But the teams that manage to do it are the ones that you can see are successful on the field consistently.
Man, that's amazing. Howard, we can't thank you enough, man, for hopping on here. You are amazing. We're going to have to get you back on again, man, at some point to just, break down all the things in that NFL. And I know you're looking forward to the draft. We are as well, JB.
Yeah, Howard, I'm doing a live draft party. We'll have former NFL guys joining the show tonight and stuff. So if you ain't doing nothing, man, maybe I'll hit you up to come on and talk about the top 10 picks or so.
Sure. Yeah, do that. Where are you guys located?
I'm in LA. We're in LA area. Yeah, but I'm looking in Scottsdale. Trust me. I gotta get the hell out of this mess hole. But
I moved here about 4.5 years ago, and after being in St. Louis for a long time, the summers are hot, but man, it is beautiful out here. So definitely look at that. Definitely look at that.
Definitely it is. It's LA prices now. That's the problem. The LA damn prices now. That's the problem.
It's working.
Man, can't thank you enough, Howard. Hopefully we'll talk to you soon.
Good day, guys. Take care.
Thanks, brother. Appreciate it.
Yeah.